Hi, and welcome to the KindlED Podcast, where we dig into the art and science behind kindling the motivation, curiosity, and mental well being of the young humans in our lives.
Together, we'll discover practical tools and strategies you can use to help kids unlock their full potential and become the strongest version of their future selves. Welcome to KindlED. Hey, Katie, how's it going today?
So good. How are you doing?
I am much better. I was very sick and now I'm not sick. So now I'm very busy, but I am very happy to be healthy.
I'm so happy you're feeling better. Being sick is terrible.
Yes. So I'm super excited to interview our guest today. Can you tell us a little bit more about who we're going to have on?
I thought you would never ask. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of talking to Josh Dahn, who is the CEO and co founder of Synthesis, but he's also done a lot of other interesting things, which I will now tell you about. Josh directed at Astra School on the campus of SpaceX for 6 years. He's currently the executive director of Astra Nova School and co founder of Synthesis, an ed tech company that does pioneering work in both the hard skills, AI math tutoring, and soft skills, collaborative thinking games, that all children need. Josh also writes and produces the Conundrums video series, which has been viewed by millions of students in classrooms around the world. Let's jump into our conversation with Josh. Josh Dahn, welcome to the KindlED Podcast. We're super excited to have you on today.
I'm really happy to be here.
We are so excited. So I would love for us to just dive right in. And can you please tell us your story? What is your big why? And what is the change you are seeking to make in the world?
Well, I had the opportunity of a lifetime to start a school at SpaceX. I was a Teach for America Corps member out of college and taught for 4 years in Las Vegas. And I came to LA not really sure where I would get a teaching job and ended up at this school for gifted kids, Mulholland Drive, a really different place than the schools that I had taught at in Las Vegas. And in my second year of teaching, I met Elon Musk, who had kids at the school, and we had a parent-teacher conference. And out of that conference came a visit to SpaceX. And out of that visit to SpaceX came an opportunity to start a school together, which was known as Ad Astra. And it started really small. It was really just 10 kids for that first maybe 6 months. And the school lasted 6 years on the campus of SpaceX, largely serving the children of SpaceX employees. And since then, I've taken some of the insights from that original school project and spun them out. Things like Conundrums, which are 1-minute ethical quandaries that we share with the world through Class Dojo. A school, a nonprofit school called Astra Nova School, which is fully online for middle school kids around the world. And the final one would be a startup called Synthesis, which takes the team thinking games I designed at Astra and then brings them to scale through software. So those are the projects that I work on. And my big why, I think, is just I've been very fortunate to be able to think about the big picture. Working for someone like Elon, who doesn't really suffer fools and does not take the status quo as an answer. So the question is always like, how might this improve? How could it be better? And what are the course corrections? And so to design a school that didn't have any expectations other than to make it great, and really just that was truly the idea, like make the school great. I feel as though those 6 years were helpful in articulating like what is it that matters in a child's education, and then how might we design experiences that serve the big picture. So that's my why, is like, what's the big picture, what matters most, and then what are the types of experiences you can have within a school that are likely to beget the memories that will stay with you and be kind of foundational as you grow old. And a lot of it is student agency, specifically around collaborative decision making. So what is the sort of caliber of a decision that a child can make in the course of a school day? To what extent are they able to disagree constructively with those that they're with, and agree as well? But I think constructive disagreement is something we all believe should happen more often in the world. And that could include disagreeing constructively with your teacher. So trying to find opportunities for that. And I guess just a more joyous way to spend time, and more kids that are well equipped to contribute to the good in the world. That would be my big why, and what I hope to see.
Beautiful. I love that vision.
That's amazing. And can I dive a little deeper? And then you said make a school great. What exactly does that look like? You said collaborative, being able to be collaborative, agency. So are there other pieces of this make a school great recipe that you discovered?
The real challenge of that Astra was the fear that it would end after like a month, you know, that I would leave. And it wasn't that I was so afraid to leave. I was actually totally fine with leaving and kind of taking the risk. It was more the regret that I anticipated I would feel if the project either just never really got off the ground, or it started but I wasn't able to see it through, like even like the first school year. So there was a huge moment of relief when it felt like I was able to bank that first school year, that we made it through, and that even if it we didn't have a year two, that year one could stand as something that had happened in the world and could sort of go from there. I think that the natural thing to do when you're working for someone like Elon is that you're going to look for sort of the best and brightest as it relates to particular fields. That Elon was very insistent that he wanted people who had seen kind of the cutting edge of their field. And I think that's maybe something that SpaceX and Tesla and the companies that Elon works on do uniquely well, is they're either creating the cutting edge or have a very clear understanding of what the present state of technology is. So for Elon, it was like, well, if we're going to teach physics at the school, like we should have someone on staff who has a deep experience in physics and is working at the cutting edge of the field, and also, by the way, has an interest in teaching elementary and middle school kids. So at times, I have to say, like, it was very difficult to hire people like that who would have the extra time or would have sort of the emotional capacity to be working with kids that are just learning kind of the basics of physics. But I mean, largely that's how it started, is like, okay, we'll find people in these different fields that are going to be able to connect with the kids, but also give them a sense of what really matters, rather than say, like, well, you have to go through all these fundamentals before you can even approach any of the kind of interesting ideas that we read about in the news. And I think that's maybe the wrong approach, is like lead with the wondrous things to get kids engaged and start thinking about it. And then you can always give them some of the fundamentals once they've seen like what are the leading scientists thinking about, and or mathematicians and all the rest. But I think for me, and I think part of this was my own inadequacy as an engineer or mathematician or scientist, was like, okay, what to be a principal of a school of 10 kids is kind of a misnomer, right? There's not a whole lot of administrative work, especially a school that ignores a lot of the administrative requirements, or at least in those early days did. So for me, it was like, well, how do the kids put it all together? So if I know that my colleague, like Dr. Rose, like she's a brilliant chemist, and not every kid has the opportunity, of course, to learn from someone who has their PhD from Caltech in chemistry. But given what they're learning in chemistry, and given what they're doing in physics or in math or in English or all the rest, like how would they put it all together and actually make decisions and do the types of things that we do at our best in a workplace, which is work in teams in pursuit of creating new things in the world. So for me, that started as a class I called Synthesis, which was really the idea of putting it all together based on Howard Gardner's synthesizing mind, and to try to, with my limited skills in like Adobe Illustrator, put together, I guess you call them projects. Maybe that's how but maybe more than that, more like case studies, and then eventually games. And so for me, the idea of making it great was like, yes, you're going to have really knowledgeable people that can push you forward and give you kind of the fundamentals, but also kind of the things that are the cutting edge. But then also you'll have an opportunity as an individual, but also in teams, to make real decisions that will have consequences within the class. And you will get really comfortable working on a variety of teams on a diversity of problems. That was my North Star. So that was my interpretation of Make It Great. I think other people would have interpreted it differently, but I think there was always a creative imperative at Astra, partly out of fear, frankly, but partly out of the sense that there was nothing holding us back from doing what we thought was most important for the kids.
Yeah, so I just want to call out here that that's wildly different than what most people in like traditional education, or like people that would quote unquote be at the cutting edge of the education field, very different than what they would probably say is great. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Yeah.
So then how for you as like a small school leader at that point, which a lot of our listeners are small school leaders, micro school leaders, um, walk us through kind of like your mental framing of that. Like, did you have a lot of imposter syndrome of like, who am I to like do this very differently? Or, walk us through that.
Well, it always starts with imposter syndrome, close to home. So when I told my parents that I had met with Elon in November of 2013, and he had discussed this idea of creating a school together, and that, you know, like, did I want to lead it? My parents couldn't believe that would, they were like, what do you mean? Like, what do you, like, he's going to hire you? to be a principal. It's like you're a fifth grade teacher. So why would he hire a fifth grade teacher when he could hire the dean of Stanford's education school or literally anyone in the world? I mean, I say this not because my parents don't believe in me, like they absolutely do, right? They've been nothing but loving and supportive. But it was, yeah, of course I felt like an imposter. And not only that, I mean, I really have an aversion to math. I mean, you know, I can do math, but that was never a great love of mine. And so to work for a highly technical person who presides over the most technical companies basically that exist in the world, there's always that imposter syndrome. So for me, I mean, the best way to just address that directly was to hire people who are so comfortable in that space and to make sure that that would not be a limiting factor, that the kids would get the type of, computer science and math and science education that I know would be important to Elon and really is important to all children. I think from a design perspective, I knew that we would need to do something different. And I think from the very beginning, I wanted to be honest about what was at Astra, what was a product of true excellence or ingenuity, and what was just a product of resource. This continues to this day, to be really honest about what is truly good and what work is unique and worthwhile to share with the world, and what work is yeah, when you have the money to hire remarkable people or you have the recognition to be able to write an email that says, hey, this school is at SpaceX, would you consider coming to teach a few hours a week? That's just not the reality for most children. So that's, I think, and also I have to say the expectation when people would come to visit the school, they were hoping to see something different. I don't mean to say that the school was great because I would be embarrassed for it not to be great. But I do think, when you imagine a school at SpaceX and then you enter the gates and you park and you walk in, I mean, I think that people are expecting something really different.
Those kids are building rockets like all the time, right?
Yeah, they're building rockets, robots are assembling their education. Right, like something like that. And so for me, it was just really important to not be sort of conventional in terms of like the way that excellent schools say that they're excellent. And it was important to me to do something that you would look at and say, well, that really is quite a bit different. And I wonder if this thing would have a place in other schools. Because the question was always like, well, how does that Astra scale? And I think that the right place to settle as a school was like, no, the school itself is not built to scale. But the ideas that are worth sharing from this experimental model are things that we should humbly share with the world. And if they're useful, fantastic. If they're not, like fair enough. But we have to be honest with ourselves about what we would even feel comfortable sharing, not because we don't want to be transparent. It's because it may not be good enough to even share. And we shouldn't just assume that because we've given this like once in an opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity to do this, that everything we do is good, because it's not. And I think as school leaders, your listeners know that there are things that, yeah, I always think of it as like what is insufficient, sufficient, and then you kind of go up from there. And I think we had a lot of things that were sufficient, right? They worked as a school, but in some days it felt like putting on an elaborate pageant every day of all the different elements that have to come together to create a compelling school day. And some of that magic you lose as our school has gone fully online. But part of it also was a school that was still very much in development and yet was sort of thrust not on stage because we were always pretty secretive, but people would visit kind of waiting to see a finished product, and we very much were not that, especially in those first 3 years.
Well, I think that that's so real and authentic because anyone who has tried to start a school knows that that's a very messy operation and it's not like this finished product. And I just want any of you out there listening to hear that and to really understand like that is what starting a small school is all about, and to stay in that mess until you figure it out. That's like the magic that I'm hearing in your story, Josh. Is you just stayed in that mess and now you have like identified these principles and kind of the core of it, and that's possible for other people too.
Absolutely. You got to stay in the mess for a long time and then find the things that you do uniquely well. And then there's some things that would just probably be sufficient for a long time, and there'll probably be some things that are insufficient, frankly. And that's totally to be expected. I mean, I had, of course, the existential fear that Elon would walk in and, see something that was woefully insufficient, and then to say, hey, this is woefully insufficient, and then me to say, yeah, I know. And then the question is like, well, then why is it woefully insufficient? And the true answer is because it takes time, right, to build an excellent thing. And now that, Elon, of course, knows that, but that's always a bit of the risk, especially, I'm sure as school leaders, when you have parents that come in and are seeing things, or, the kids are reporting home, like what's going on. And, there are always weaknesses, especially in those first few years. So, you know, it felt like to me that investing more in our strengths was probably the right way rather than trying to, I think get those insufficiencies up to sufficient but really focus on making things extraordinary. And then you're going to be in an okay place.
My favorite Elon um, moment in recent years is when one of the rockets like explodes and he just claps and he's like, "All right, great job, team! Like we learned something." So he does have that culture, and I think that's really important to set that right culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would love to dive a little bit more into culture. And I mean, you've been a traditional classroom teacher, so I'm sure, the culture is very different than in these schools that you've started. So what type of culture do you think is important to have in an educational setting?
Starting as what effectively was a homeschool share. I mean, when you're talking about the schools you visited, so 5 to 20 students, the schools that you visited today, which by the way, visiting 4 schools in a day is really impressive. You'll find different cultures in all the different environments. And usually there's a through line, that you'll find, especially with schools from the same network or whatever else. And I think, for us, we started as was effectively a homeschool share. And we were for a time, in a home. It was Gene Wilder's old house that Elon owned that was, I think, just protecting his view, basically. But this, as you would imagine, really idiosyncratic, quirky house that was perched on a kind of a cliffside next to 2 sort of mega mansions that have been built, in the last probably 10 years. And so at that time, it had like that family feel in terms of the kind of the culture of the place. And in some ways, Elon had 5 kids all at the school. When you have, 15 kids, well, that's a pretty sizable, percentage of the student body. So I think for us, a big piece of culture was when we moved from that house to SpaceX and we're able to build out our own campus. And I think part of the culture always was that the kids, it's not that they have like a say, that doesn't sound quite right. It was more than that. It's like they were we were part of the decision making body that was at Astra. I guess to share an example. So we took over a space on the West Campus of SpaceX they finished it probably an hour before the first day of school. And I don't mean finished like finished. I mean finished like only now available for people to be inside of it. And we finished that first year. I think we had a portable toilet like for the whole year. And as we kind of move into the second year on campus, we thought that all this work would happen over the summer. And of course, none of that work gets done because, there's bigger priorities in the world than Ad Astra's, chemistry lab or whatever. And so Elon comes to us and says, listen, SpaceX, they've been caught up with a bunch of stuff. How about I just give you the money and you guys make it happen? And we're like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I don't know, figure it out. So, we in kind of the similar vein of like make it great, it's like spend the money thoughtfully. So it's like, okay, so spend the money thoughtfully, expand the space to what we want it. And I guess we'll start calling general contractors and sort of figure it out. And so those, who are running these small schools, you kind of know how this works. You wear many hats. You just try to figure these things out. And I think for us, we wanted to authentically involve the kids in all of those decisions about how we should allocate the space and should we do this thing or that thing and here's the time frame and how important are the bathrooms because like we could do that first but that's that's going to come at the expense of the chemistry lab and all the rest. And so I think from the very beginning there was always this sense that we respect the kids as decision makers. We want to hear the way that they think through things. We are comfortable testing their assumptions because they'll say something but we'll like, okay, why, and kind of talk it all through. Physically constructing a school has now made way as we've moved online to working on conundrums. So these conundrums are like 1 to 2 minute ethical quandaries. They've been viewed millions of times for schools around the world. They're freely available on our YouTube channel or through Class Dojo. And the idea is like to get these kind of decision making spaces into schools. And part of the cool thing as an Astra Nova student is actually writing these questions. You're getting feedback from schools around the world. You're like hiring the voiceover talent, working with the animators directly, giving feedback. You're like doing the real work. So I think for us always, it's like, how do we give them a taste for what the real work is? And hopefully a sense of what it's like to work on a high functioning team. And I think that's what we can model uniquely as adults is what it's like to be a member of a high functioning team. And it doesn't mean that it's always high functioning, but certainly to be transparent and vulnerable in that and making that a part of how we operate. So, it's interesting. The school has changed in so many ways from how it started with just like the 10 kids at SpaceX. And now it's like 250 with like 200 of those kids coming from around the world who are like not US based. I mean, that's probably not right. Probably 150 or so students, who are not based in the US. And yet still, like, the culture when we all get together at the end of the year, it feels very much like it did in the early days. I think part of that is kind of the approach towards challenge and complexity and real vulnerability as it relates to just not knowing and trying to figure it out and making your thinking visible and not only inviting them in, but really taking them seriously when they have something to offer. I'd say those are the things that I'm like most proud of culture wise.
I heard you mention choice, respecting the child as a decision maker, and then authentic work, or we call that a kind of like an authentic audience. Like the work is real, it's not fake. And then vulnerability, creating the space that's safe enough to fail without shame. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
I saw some of that yesterday too, and what I heard you say as well is asking the kids questions. There was a transition time. They went from doing like a show and tell to a history presentation, and the one girl asked, "Hey, can we like keep these, our show and tell out while she presents?" And instead of saying, "Nope, I'm the teacher, no, you're not allowed to do this," the teacher simply asked, "Well, what do you think? Do you think what will happen if you keep that toy out?" And the girl sat there and looked and said, "Oh, you know what? It's going to distract me. I'm not going to be able to listen. So I'm going to go put it away." I just feel that that is so different than our traditional classrooms. And we're able to just really put, the rope, I guess, in the child's hands and give them just that control to make those decisions themselves. And then they did. They were great audience members to listen to this presentation about George Washington. It was pretty fabulous.
Yeah, something that I'll call out there is that none of the things that Josh just said cost any money, right? Like Josh gets to start fancy Elon Musk school. We're all jealous, yes. But the things that he's surfacing as the winners, these North Stars, don't actually cost any money. These are belief-based treatment of children level type modifications that can be made to get the culture right. And what I see when I walk into a learning space where I know that they have those three things, I see kids who are super happy. I see kids who are engaged in their learning. No one's having conversations about like, man, how do we motivate these kids? Like, do you guys have motivation problems?
Very rarely, very rarely. You wanna, diffuse the, adversarial relationship that so many kids are used to as it relates to school and versus the student, and so grades, of course, being maybe the most obvious example of that, and also the authority of the teacher. We try to diffuse that by just, like, what's not we don't engage in it, it's not part of who we are. We really I'm sure that you have this in so many of your schools, is that we're all on a similar journey in different ways, and we really bond over these like shared experiences that we have. And I think that kids respond to that, and if they're not motivated in a particular way or not like really wanting to do the work, then it's a conversation. It's not because really, as we know, schools, there really isn't you really don't in some ways you have control and in some ways you maybe have power and all the rest, but like it's not if it's not earned in the right way, then it really is quite useless. I can't really make a kid care about the thing that we want to get across. And so and kids sense that. And so rather than fight it, like just try to understand and to do engaging things. But also I think sometimes in my early days of teaching, I leaned too heavily on novelty and maybe I'd call it performance, um, sort of like teacher as, cult figure. And I think that that is something that I kind of had to learn the hard way, that as a designer of learning experiences, it's very important to have variety and depth and novelty and all the rest. But, really the kids have to start to take ownership over that themselves. And I couldn't own it for them. And I think that that was maybe a little misstep at some point in my career of trying to just always do things bigger, better, faster. And it's not always that, right? At some level, like it just wasn't landing. It wasn't because of me. It was because I hadn't helped kids develop the capacity to care on their own for reasons that I wouldn't maybe fully understand. So anyway, I would just add that as an important piece of culture.
Okay, so I'm hearing early in our conversation you mentioned like bringing in these really amazing experts, and now I'm hearing you kind of say like it isn't the expert. So like walk me through kind of your um, the development of your thought process on how important getting someone who is like amazing and there to actually teach the chemistry? Or, what is the role of the expert or the adult in the room?
I'm conflicted by it because certainly I've seen like models like Acton where there aren't teachers, right? There are guides. And I think that Prenda maybe is more similar to that than what I had at Astra, where it's not only that you have teachers that have PhDs, it's like, no, they're actually working in the field, right? It's not it, the fact that they're even teaching is sort of like a kind of a negotiated thing where, well, I guess I could do that, or I'm happy to, because people generally want to give back, and doing so for kids that are really curious about the field is a good way of doing that. I feel as though our like most sacred responsibility is to show them all the fascinating avenues that sort of exist, like the kind of connections that exist, the wonder that is out there. In some ways, I think curiosity is inherent, but still like modeling like a more active curiosity. And I think never you can never overestimate the power of like just sort of creative productivity. Just like creativity is what makes us human. And I think those are the roles of an adult. And none of those things that I mentioned necessarily require a deep sense of, a bunch of content knowledge, so to speak. Um, with all that being said, I think for some of our kids specifically, the idea of engaging with a highly knowledgeable adult who like knows the field and knows what's interesting, he can show you some of those interesting facets and avenues that are worth pursuing, that can have a tremendous impact. And it doesn't have to be in every field, doesn't have to be all the time. And those people can be found outside of a school. And I would just say, and some kids, of course, just, even if you're having the world's expert, share whether Richard Feynman or you're watching Carl Sagan or whatever, you're watching someone on video, it may just not translate in the way that it, of course, it does in person. And so when you find those special people, whether it's guest speakers or anything else, I think they can hit all those notes that I think are most important. If you have the luxury of having those people kind of come a few days a week, well, then amazing. And I think in a similar way to what so many of your listeners probably deal with is that you have a lot of people that are kind of come from time to time, or like you have, once a term or once a year, they come on only on Tuesdays. And I think for us, it was always trying to find people that could really connect with the kids, and we would take whatever they could give, even if it was just, 10 minutes once a month, because those 10 minutes, if done well, can be really powerful. So trying to move beyond the idea that, well, you're either full-time or you're part-time or you're a guest speaker, but really trying to be flexible with all of that, even by term. And we still to this day do that. I mean, Astra Nova, as I said, is a school of about 230, 250 kids. And we create something like 70 unique classes a term. And we do that 3 times a year. So over the course of a year, we almost create as many unique classes as we have students, which in some ways is reckless. But in other ways, like when you want an experimental school, like we're always looking for sort of compelling experiences that you wouldn't find anywhere else. And so we've been fortunate to find people who have that hour to give for that particular term, and then we take it and make it happen. So in that same kind of way, that openness to people from all over, it's rare that you meet someone who doesn't have an interesting story to tell. Almost everyone does, and helping the kids kind of hear that interesting story and kind of relate to it and then connect it to themselves is something that you can get really good at doing if you look.
This idea of an expert, I think that the most important thing, I think there's definitely a guide like role that's really important in education. But I think we don't want to push that forward and say like we never need any experts. Like it's a boat, it's a yes and there. And I think the most important thing that that expert brings is that they can create a curiosity for that field way more effectively because they're deeply curious about that thing, and you can't transfer a passion that you don't have, right? So if you're looking for a way to light a kid's curiosity on fire, it's like connect them with someone who's already like the flame, like they live day to day, like in just all of their activity is pushing that interest forward, that physics, chemistry, like whatever it is, and connecting with them with that it just can be like really impactful. And so not only is there like a content delivery, I think piece to that is important, but also just this like contagious curiosity.
So, Josh, I would love to know, where do you see kids getting stuck in the process of becoming a strong team player? Why do you think they get stuck there? What's causing this?
Same ways we get stuck, ego, the sense of inadequacy, the sense of ego, yeah, egocentric sort of things. I mean, for me, like teamwork in school meant there was a project, and the person who cared the most about their grade would be the one who inevitably would take control, and the rest would try to do the minimal viable thing. Or, maybe when you get a little bit older, it was a divide and conquer. There were very few decisions that were made together, even fewer decisions where it was like the subject of this conjecture and criticism in pursuit of maybe like the best approach, and then some level of reflection as to whether that approach was the right one to take. I think so much of it kind of comes down to the basics of like be kind and join in. And if kids can do both of those things, then you've got a chance to have a good collaborative experience. And when it doesn't work, I'd say it's less the kindness that's not there. It's more of the joining in, and that's for any number of reasons, like the ones I mentioned. But I think part of the importance of the collaborative work is that you have to care about the work itself, and we have to just be honest about the kind of projects that traditionally schools maybe put in front of kids, or even schools like at Astra. We're asking the kids to do this project in teams, and there's really just not a lot of investment in the actual. I mean, it's not really clear why. If sort of the decision making leads to a product that then gets evaluated by a teacher, and that's sort of the end of the road, I just think that's really demotivating, versus one that's a little bit more dynamic, and the feedback is kind of happening throughout the process, whether that from a physical environment or from an adult just kind of supporting you along the way. But I like to create a, I try to think of design as like, well, what will provoke kids or give them a conflict to like really not be sure if it's this thing or that thing, or maybe this thing and a little bit of that thing, but like really try to figure out the different parameters, and then go back and forth with one another, because that's where that sense of like ownership can really take over and creates a much richer experience than the ones that I guess I had as a kid in school.
I want to hear a little bit more about synthesis. What is it? What should parents expect? Like if they sign their kids up for synthesis, what's that experience? What are they going to get out of that?
The class at Astra was this like decision making space for kids. And with a school of only like 40 kids, there are only so many unique configurations of kids within kind of an age band. And so in a lot of ways, the idea of synthesis was to give you real experience working on teams on compelling problems with kids around the world, so that you're not just constrained to the kids that are in your immediate school environment or class. I started, as I said, with case studies. So I would write these like elaborate fictional stories of this Playa del Rey seafood company and the challenges they're facing with all number of different things, and kind of the decision points along the way as it relates to personnel, as it relates to strategy, as it relates to deal making and pricing and all the rest. And that was a fun creative exercise. But in the end, you still, it was a little bit of like role playing. Like the kids they knew the company was made up, and they knew that I was sort of giving them the decision points, and they were supposed to kind of think and care about them. And I think that worked. But I think what was better is when I moved towards game making, actually. And not games maybe in the traditional sense, but these kind of decision making spaces where you're trying to decide which works of art would fit in your collection to create the greatest amount of harmony, knowing that you are bringing your collection of art that you won in an auction against other teams to these cities that have unique populations and demand for specific works of art, and kind of managing all of this as a team with only one decision that you're really making, which is how much are we going to, what's our maximum bid for this work of art, and where are we going to travel to in order to, to get the highest score across those different metrics. That was a game called Art for All. And at Astra, we had actual paddles, and the kids were doing the live bidding, and we'd have, their gallery up, and they'd have to justify like what the through line was between all the works of art. And sometimes there really wasn't one. So it would be interesting to see if the kids would stretch in that way. And in other ways, it created real regret that you chose to go to this city under these assumptions, but then the other two teams went to the same market and they had stronger collections, and you really had a rough week, so to speak. And then you had course corrections to make for the next week. And then looking back on the kind of 8-week sequence, you're like, I really wish that we should have done it this way. Right. And that's like what you want, is that you're so in it that when you finish, the thing that you would actually want to do most is like do it again and start like all the way back at the beginning, because now armed with what you'd be able to make real changes. So anyway, taking the principles of this class, we created a company in 2020. And the idea, yeah, was to bring thousands of kids together to play what I call team thinking games. So the way it works is right now, we, just Wednesdays and Saturdays, kids log in to get match made into teams based on their, roughly their age, but also their ability level. And they get thrown into a room that looks very much like a Zoom room with kids they haven't met. And they have this common object that they're trying to understand, which is in the form of a game. And what I think is really special about it is that, each of the games kind of sits on a unique collaborative pillar, with the idea being that if you can show that you can make any team better within synthesis, the games of synthesis that sit on the collaborative pillars, that you are getting real experience um, with the dexterity that's needed to be someone who can make any team better kind of in the wider world. And so in our idea, like this ideal of a super collaborator, one who just by virtue of them being part of a group of people, raises the level. And that means in ways sometimes that are really small. Like you might be the least experienced member of a team, or one who, just maybe doesn't have as much knowledge in that like particular area, but there are still these really important things that you can do to kind of push the team forward. So synthesis is all about the pursuit of giving kids these experiences at a young age, getting a real taste for what it's like to be part of a high functioning team, and developing the confidence to express your voice and to bring about the voices of others, which is something that, when talking about what holds people back, I think a lot of the time it's that you're waiting for your voice to be heard, or you want to kind of get in your point. But what happens is you're sort of giving your opinion or what we should do into a vacuum, and it's not echoed by anybody else. And then it's just a bunch of kids that are kind of doing it in parallel, but not in an integrated kind of way. So synthesis is all about feedback and course corrections to help kids be more effective collaborators. And yeah, that's what it is. So synthesis has two products, Teams and Tutor. I'm talking here about synthesis Teams, which are the collaborative thinking games. And then there's something called synthesis Tutor, which is a whole additional story.
So my kids have played this recently and it's really fun, and I can absolutely see it stretching them in ways that they need to be stretched, and I'm really grateful for it as a tool. So thanks for inventing it. It's a really cool way to do what you're saying, to extract kind of like the good, all of the good that you learned, and make it more accessible to everyone, because not everyone can sign their kids up for Astra Nova or Ad Astra, or go to Elon Musk's school. So it's like, how do we get these things accessible to kids? And I think synthesis is a really amazing tool to do that for kids. And I see it working with my kids too. So thanks for sharing that.
Josh, this has been such an amazing conversation. I have learned so much. I thought I knew a little bit about these schools, but oh my gosh, you're just opening my eyes to just how important collaboration is in these really strong cultures where kids get to be in the driver's seat. So thank you so much for just all your work and dedication to bring this to, so like Kaity said, to so many people around the whole world, not just, the kids that get to go to at Astra or Astra Nova. And so I would love, as we wrap up, we ask every guest that we have on the podcast this question. So, who is someone in your life that has kindled your curiosity, motivation, or has helped you become who you are today?
For me, it's my mom, who just has a real, she loves to figure things out. And she has this artistic and creative mind that I just so admire. And what I think has been most powerful for me is that I don't know, she thinks of herself in such expansive ways. Like she doesn't think like I do this thing and not that thing. She's sort of open to doing anything. So, in a weekend she would be putting down pavers to create, a walkway and a patio, and then there's all the gardening stuff that goes with it. But then there's also she's like designing something as part of the house, and then we're also going to the art museum, and then we're of course like we're gonna go I don't know, try to play tennis at the like a local court. I don't like always just this like frenetic activity and sense that she's like able to bring like new things always into the world if she just applies some time towards it. So I'd like to call out my mom in particular, because she's been a huge source of inspiration for me my entire life. As I kind of mentioned earlier, when it comes to the imposter syndrome stuff, there was a moment. I didn't mention this, but when I met with Elon in November of 2013, I didn't hear from him for 2 months. So we ended the meeting with him saying, "Listen, if you want to do this, like, let me know. And I was like, oh, of course, yeah, like, I'm in, right? Like, I'm going to think about this. Like, I'm totally in. He's like, whatever, just like still think of it. Like, you should think about it and kind of let me know. So of course, like, I couldn't sleep, and I wrote him, at like 2 a.m. and said, of course I'm in, and here's like all the things that need to be done. And then truly, you can imagine, like, early November, Thanksgiving goes by, into December, holidays, Christmas time, New Year's, all of these things happen. And my mom, to her everlasting credit, said to me, I'm sure Elon will write you back. Of course he will. Why wouldn't he? Now, of course, at the time, I'm totally lost it. I was like, what do you mean? Like, of course, like, no, he's not. He's like, not only is he's busy, like, I'm sure that there's someone else who's actually more qualified to do this. She's like, no, I'm sure that he will. And I'm sure that he'll write to you, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And, and maybe only in a way that maybe only like a parent can, like, believe in their child. And so that kind of belief and sense that, like, no, you can create something unique, and, the world is better off for having you in it. I have to say that that's the thing that has changed my life. And I want to thank my mom for that particularly. So thanks for asking the question. And it's nice to be able to talk about my mom in a podcast. So thank you.
That's so powerful.
Yeah, and I hope you can see that, like, you are that for hundreds of kids now, right? Like, you have become this frenetic force of energy and doing all of these creative things and wrapping these kids up. And one of my favorite quotes, I don't know, Adriane, do I share this like every other episode? I feel like Gordon Neufeld, a child's heart finds something to attach to and becomes like it. And that is our biggest leverage point as people who want to kindle and inspire this next generation, is our relationship with them and the example that we set for them. So thank you so much for coming on, Josh. How can people find out more about Synthesis and your work?
Sure. So Synthesis is synthesis.com, and Astronova is astronova.org. And the conundrums can be found on Astra Nova's YouTube channel or on Class Dojo.
Amazing. Thanks so much for stopping by and chatting with us today.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
That's it for today. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the KindlED Podcast. If this episode was helpful to you, please like, subscribe, and follow us on social at Prenda Learn. If you have a question you'd like us to address, leave a comment or email us at podcast@prenda.com. You can also join our Facebook group, the KindlED Collective, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Sunday Spark.
The KindlED Podcast is brought to you by Prenda. Prenda makes it easy for you to start and run an amazing microschool based on all of the things we talk about here on the KindlED Podcast. If you want more information about guiding a Prenda microschool, go to prenda.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep kindling.